Okay, what I want to talk about today is the basics of cycles rendering in Blender. Cycles rendering is really cool. It's a relatively new thing, at least as far as Blender is concerned, but it's been around for several years now. And when you're in Blender, the first thing you're going to see up here is your Blender renderer, which is right here, and you can choose Cycles Renderer. But before we do that, one of the things that we want to do is we want to make sure that our GPU is actually taking care of the rendering in Blender instead of the CPU. So you're going to go to User Preferences, and you go to System, and then you scroll down, and right there you should see Cycles Compute Device, and that Cycles Compute Device should be set to CUDA. And you need to have a CUDA card in order to do that and to do that well. Get my microphone set up a little bit better here. There we go. And once that's set, you also need to click Save User Settings. That's actually really important to make sure that you've got the user settings set up correctly. So you just click Save User Settings, and then you're really good to go. So now, then I'm going to take the renderer and I'm going to go to Cycles Renderer. Now there's a couple of things that you really need to work on first before you can do much with cycles rendering. The first thing is you need to set your lights. So right now we've got the light and we can set it to what we want. And you can click Use Nodes, and it's going to take the surface and it's going to set it to an emission. And now you can kind of play with whatever kind of light you want it to be. Just do an area light, and you can kind of see how that works. And you can go down here to rendered mode, and you'll see that it's going to kind of show you what the light's going to look like on your object. Now, if I, let's see, get out of rendered mode here, okay, go back down to solid. When I work with texturing and I work with cycles, one of the things that I like to do is I kind of like to make my own workspace. And I've seen a lot of people do the same thing on YouTube and whatever. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go up to the default, and I'm going to add a new default right there. I'm just going to call it cycles. Okay. And then I'm going to make the timeline. I'm going to take this, I'm going to go down and grab that, make it a lot bigger, and I'm going to go down here to the bottom where the clock is. I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to move it to the node editor. The node editor is going to be really important whenever we edit objects and edit their textures. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take and I'm going to go up to the top right hand corner. There's these little diagonal lines in the top hand corner, and I'm going to left click on that and drag a new window out. And then I can kind of bring this back, make this a little bit smaller, and I'm going to take my center one here, and I'm going to set that to rendered mode. And I'm going to keep this one over here in just my regular 3D solid view, and that allows me to kind of navigate, because you can click objects here, but it doesn't really tell you what you're clicked on in rendered mode. But in the regular 3D solid view, you can see exactly what you've clicked on and exactly what you're doing. So it's very helpful to have that, and you can make one bigger or smaller, whatever you want, and that helps a lot. So now I've got my cube selected here, and we're just gonna make a couple simple textures. But first I'm gonna scale it a little bit. So I'm just gonna hit scale on the Z axis here, shrink it a little bit in the X axis. Kind of bring it up to the, I'll just leave it right there in about the middle of the grid. That's totally fine. And then we can swivel around it in rendered mode here too. And there's really nothing happening with the object because we don't have a material. So once you've set cycles renderer, it's going to look a lot different than it does with Blender render. When you get the Blender render, you click new, and then it gives you a whole bunch of options. But as soon as you hit a new material in cycles render, it's going to default to the diffuse, and you have a color here, and then what you're going to see is over in the nodes, you're going to see your material output, which is always what the base color is going to be, and you're just going to see your color here. And you can drag these around, you can organize them however you want, which is going to become really important as we get a little bit closer to this. And I have to say, I'm not really a cycles rendering expert yet. I'm learning this. It's really cool, but nodal rendering or nodal texturing like this is actually something that a lot of 3D programs do. A lot of gaming engines use this. Unreal Game Engine uses nodal editing. even Unity, which doesn't have a nodal editor, I know a lot of people will actually purchase a nodal texture editor for Unity because it's just so much better. Your results are just so much better. So anyway, so we've got this basic color here, and we can adjust this color and kind of make it whatever we want to do. So you can take this color, you can just kind of click on it here, and then you get your RGB wheel. You can kind of change it to whatever you want, hue saturation, whatever. You can do hex codes like web codes. I always stick with RGB, and you can make the object whatever color you want, and you can change its darkness. You can do the sliders here with red, green, and blue, and you can also change the alpha. You can change the opacity of a color. We're just going to leave it be right now where it is. And we're going to talk about how the nodal editor can actually really do some really cool stuff. So before we do too much complicated stuff, one of the really neat things about the nodal editor is your ability to kind of like mix colors. So I'm going to hover over the nodes here, and I'm going to hit Shift A, and I'm going to add, and I'm going to go to shader, and there you're going to see a whole bunch of other stuff. So we're going to add another diffuse texture here. We'll just click on that, and we'll bring them right down next to each other. And we're going to make kind of like a wooden texture here first. So I'll just make like a green to start with. And I always like to do this because it just kind of helps me see. The next thing that we're going to need to do is we're going to need a mixer. And when you go into the Add menu with Shift A, there's just so much stuff here. I obviously can't cover it all in one demo. I'm going to show you how to do a couple of things. I can show you how these mixers work. You can do mixers within mixers. It's like the Matrix. And it gets really complicated, but it's really cool what you can end up doing with this. So we're going to go to shader, and I'm going to go to a mix, and I've got this mix shader. Now there's a couple things I can do. I can just click it here, or I can drag it down, and what's really cool is if you do that, it will interject itself in between the two. And it will put this in the top shader, so I'm going to drag that down to the bottom. We'll take the green, and we're going to drag it here, and you notice that from the outlet, this then goes to the surface. Now let me say a couple of things about these. These little nodes, each one has kind of like a little color code on the dots as you drag those little strings or noodles or whatever you want to call them, as you drag the connections from one node to the next. If you're going from green to green, that means it is accepting a color information. If the node is a gray node, or actually no, the whole thing's a node. If this little circle on the edge of the node is a gray node, so here on the shader, over here for the roughness, that means you can, it will only accept black and white inputs. And then if it's a blue node, that means it's expecting a bump map, or a normals mapping, which is usually like a bluish reddish image. And you can do a lot with that. Well, maybe that'll be a different demo. But anyway, so right now I've got these two colors going into a mixer. And with the mixer set to 0.5, what it's doing is it's taking the red and it's taking the green and it's kind of blending them together. So if I take the shader here, if I take this and I move it over to the right, what it does is it does 100% of the bottom one and 0 the top. And if I slide this over to the left, now I've got 100% of the top color and 0 of the bottom. And again, if I go right in the middle, it's kind of making this kind of yucky, brownish, greenish, reddish, muddy, nasty color. But if I want to mix these in a way that's not uniform, what I need is I need a texture. So I'm going to scroll back here, zoom out just a little bit, and slide it over, and hit Shift A again. And this time I'm going to add myself a texture. And let's do a noise texture for right now. So I've got a noise texture here, and you'll notice I've got a gray output here, and I can then plug into this gray input, and now all of a sudden it's going to mix those two colors with a noise texture. Now there's lots of different textures that you can do. Let me just add another one here. So go texture, and let's do the Voronoi is one here, and you can kind of put that in there, and then it's kind of like a cellular type of thing, and You can increase the scale, which makes things actually, the higher the number, the smaller it's going to go. Okay, so I can kind of do something like, I don't know, it kind of looks like a bee's nest or something. By the way, you delete nodes by hitting the X key or the delete key, not the backspace key, but the delete key on your keyboard. And you can just play with a lot of these things. There's a brick texture, you know, I can push this over here and drag this in, and then I can start to adjust the sizes of the squares and everything like that. And you know, instead of looking like a big gigantic thing of popcorn at the movies, it'll end up looking like bricks. But let's just stick right now with the noise texture. So I drag that there, and now I can kind of take my scale, and I might type in 10. I might actually, I might even go 2.5 and make it a little less if we're trying to make it look like wood. And then I'll take my distortion, and I might say 1.5. And the distortion kind of adds swirls to the whole thing. It kind of makes everything look a little different. The detail kind of adds the sharpness to the difference between the edges of the colors. So if the detail level is lower, they're kind of more blurry. And if I take the detail up, then the edges between the colors are a little sharper. Depending upon the scale and depending upon the distortion, that will be more or less noticeable depending upon you know, those other factors. And the same thing, scale might be a little less noticeable if the detail is lower and the distortion's higher, or things like that. So as I increase the distortion, you can see that it almost looks like it's changing the scale, but it's not. It's actually just changing how curvy things are. But I can just drag those left or right. Now I can see I've got a pretty nice texture here that kind of looks like wood, with the exception of the fact that it's really ugly colors. So now what I'm going to do is let's just kind of middle mouse click and shift, and I can kind of shift my way around, or middle mouse click I mean, and I can just kind of shift my way around here. And let's change our colors. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go here, and I'm going to make this a brown color by going kind of orangey and going kind of dark here and making that kind of a darker brown. And then I'm going to go back and get another orangey color and make it a little lighter, and you can see I've got a pretty nice wooden texture already started there. And I can adjust it to make more contrast by making the wood darker or whatever. Now, depending upon what I wanted, I might be finished with this texture. But let's just say that I wanted this to look like it was nice, polished, finished wood. Okay, that means it would have a reflection on it. Well, I have a problem. One of the problems is you have different kinds of objects, or I mean different kinds of shaders. And right now I've got these diffuse shaders. And you can make them glossy if you wanted to. But then you can control them. You can control them a little less. So what I like to do is I will make a mixer within a mixer. So I'm going to kind of push all this over. You know what? Before I do anything, I'm going to add another object. So we're just going to add a cube here. I'll scale it down a little bit. Okay. I'm going to put it kind of close to our object here so we can kind of see the reflections of the object. And I'm going to make it a nice bright color. So I'm just going to add a new surface to that, and we'll make it a bright red. Okay. Let's go back to our piece of wood here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go Shift A, and I'm going to go to Shader, and I'm going to add another mixer. And I can just kind of drop that in there. It's pretty cool. And bring this up a little bit. And then what I'm going to do is Shift A, and I'm going to add a glossy surface texture. I'm going to bring that output from that green circle over to this one. And now you can see that I've got actually a really like a sheen on here. And the roughness is defaulted to 0.20, but if I take that all the way to the left, you see that the roughness goes down, and I can see the reflection a little bit better, but it's still kind of murky and foggy. So what I want to do is I want to take into account that I can use this slider here to balance between the top shader and the bottom shader. So that if I go to the right, it makes the bottom shader more powerful, which is my wood colors. If I slide to the left, it makes my top shader a little bit more powerful. You can see, so I made it almost mirror-like there, and I can make it, you know, a little bit less powerful there. and something in the middle is probably works. And actually you can also change things with your roughness, but the roughness really changes the way the highlights come in. So I like to kind of keep the roughness down. You see you have a real harsh specular highlight, which is, you know, what you might expect on a very shiny, well-polished piece of wood. And that I can take the balance of the shaders and kind of work this. You can also change the color. Changing the color will change how the surface reflects. So just taking that down and making that medium gray kind of changes the way that that works. And then if I take this and kind of adjust it a little bit, you can see how that kind of helps. So, you know, I can take this and make the shiny part a little bit more powerful. So I can just go 0.50, and then I can affect how kind of, I guess, milky the texture looks based upon the brightness of the glossy color, and that will actually change your reflection. You can go even further than that. You can actually give it a tone so that the reflection will end up having like a blue tone, like I just did there, or whatever. But we're just going to set it to be neutral here and just kind of put it to be gray. And now that actually looks pretty darn good. That's a good example of a nice texture. So I want to wrap this up. So this is just a real nice basic texture, and you can kind of play with that. But one of the things that I'd like to do is I'd like to talk about the displacement. So let's go to our cube here. And this is the thing that I always mess up. Displacement is tough. If you take a look at the material output, the displacement wants a gray scale, okay, input. So if I want to give my cube a little bit of a texture, I need to figure out some way of putting a grayscale input into here. And what's funny is what you might think works, or what you might think would work, doesn't always work. So for instance, and watch, this will work because, yeah. But I've tried to use like diffuse and done a white, and then done a black, and then taken them into a mixer and then use a texture on them, and it doesn't seem to work. Actually, I'm not going to mess with it right now. So what you really want to do is you can go to your you want to find the color here, and you can do a mix RGB. So now we're going to have an RGB here, and then Shift A, go to the color, and then you could set, you actually should just set your color here. So make that one black, make that one white, and then you can set a displacement. Now right now it's not doing anything, and it's not going to because we haven't set our texture. So we'll go in here, we're going to go to a texture, and we're going to go to, let's use Musgrave, that's a good one. And then if I drag this to here, you can see that the texture now comes on. So what it's doing is it's mixing the black and the white, okay, with the scale and all the other things that the Musgrave texture is doing, and it's creating kind of a series of bumps or textures or displacement on the surface of your object. Now I'm not exactly sure why they call it displacement in the nodes. For people who have a little more experience in other things, you might call it bump map or normals mapping or something like that. And normals mapping is actually a little different. This is really truly a bump map because it's using black and white to do its work. But you can kind of see how it's creating this, and you know, again, you can just kind of start playing with the scales to kind of see what's happening. You know, the detail level makes it sharper or blurrier. The dimensions, that doesn't seem to be changing much at all in this case. And each one of these things has a completely different setup. So I can delete that, and Shift A, I'll add, let's try a noise texture this time and see what happens. And now you can see kind of a nice little bump that's really soft on the surface of your object, and you can scale it up or down. I really like the noise texture a lot, and one of the reasons why I really like that is because it allows it, you take this, and then if you just make it really subtle by taking the detail level down, or one of the things you could try to do is do another mixer if you wanted to make it more subtle. But if you like to do that, then you can really kind of have like a subtle bump to your object. So take the detail level, distortion level, and now that's not so subtle, is it? And now it's very, very textured. So now you can kind of see how it's kind of casting shadows. And if I were to go here with my light and start dragging my light around, you can see how it responds to the light and the shadows by casting the shadows in a different manner, which is really kind of cool. And if I wanted to make this a little bit more subtle, probably would have to do another mix. So what I would try to do here is take this. Whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. Take this. You can use the control key, by the way, and cut through the little strings or the little noodles here. And let's just add another mixer. So we're going to go color. I'm going to do another mix RGB here. And I'll just bring this in. I don't think this is going to work, actually. Yeah, it's not working. I'm not surprised. Let's see if I did that. I'm experimenting while I'm doing a demo here. It's probably not the best thing to do. But let's try a mix shader. Why not? I don't think this will work at all. But you can also force a color input into an output. Yeah, it's not working at all. It was worth a try. And I was just going to try and put a white here and bring that in, and then slide it back and forth to create more or less of a thing. But that's definitely not working. So if I wanted to make this more, oh well, you know what I could do to make this more or less. That was dumb of me. So if I wanted to make this more or less powerful, I need to control my colors. So make this gray instead of pure black, and you can see as I'm doing that, the texture becomes less powerful. Because what it's doing is it's mixing between the two colors. And here's how that really works. And I kind of meant to explain this in the beginning, but I forgot. So the wherever you have a darker tone is equal to a lower or a depressed area in the object. And where you have a brighter tone, you have a lighter area or a higher area in the object. So by doing that, by taking my dark area and making it lighter, you're creating less contrast between the two. Or I could do the opposite, and I could take my lighter area and bring it down and create my higher area be closer to my lower area. And so now I could take and make a let's make it a little bit more brighter here so we can kind of see. So I could take my scale up to be a really, really high scale. Okay, so it almost is like lots of little dots. Uh-oh, and it crashes. But anyway, then I could make that a little bit more subtle with what I showed you. I'm not going to redo this because Blender just decided it didn't like me all of a sudden, so I'm going to end this. Hopefully this will be a good starter for you in cycles rendering. That's pretty much all I had. I will do more demos on lighting and some more complicated stuff, but right there is kind of the deal. One last thing before I go. One of the things that I tried doing for displacement mapping is instead of using the RGB mixer, I actually was using, I tried using the shader mixer that I have on the colors for, say, the wood piece. That does not work. As much as you might want it to, it does not work. You have to use the RGB mixer. So that's one big mistake that I was making. And yeah, hopefully this gets you started, and hopefully it helps you out. Sorry for the Blender crash at the end there, but yeah, whatever. Hope this helps.